Anyway, like I said, I'm going to, of course, talk about the 1960s today. Which, of course, first thing I am going to talk about, of course, is the Kennedy assassination, which, I guess is one of the first things. We've kind of already talked about the Kennedy. We've already talked about the Kennedy, like what happened mostly during his time in office. And get that to come up there for you. And why did Kennedy go to Dallas, Fort Worth? You probably wonder why did he go there first? Well, he's running for re-election, if you know much about it. And Kennedy was kind of worried that he wasn't going to be able to get re-elected if he didn't have enough support from the southern states. A lot of it had to do with some of the civil rights stuff he was trying to do in the early 60s. And so he went there with Lyndon B. Johnson, of course, to shore up the southern states and all of that. So that's why he was visiting Fort Worth and Dallas. I believe he had already gone to Florida, like Miami and all that, earlier this year. So that was basically the reason why he went there, to do some campaign stops and all of that. And so what happened, as you know, the motorcade went through the downtown area of Dallas. Of course, he was in a convertible. I think it was a Lincoln convertible. And as he went through, of course, the downtown area called Daley Plaza, he was, of course, Kennedy and the governor, also governor of Texas, John Connally, were both hit by bullets. They were shot at, of course, high-powered rifle. And I've got another picture showing like the limousine as it's going through the city right here. Of course, you can see there's his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, in the pink dress, as they talked about. There's Kennedy right here. John Connally was right here. So it's possible they may have gotten shot from behind. They do also think that Kennedy may have also been shot from what they call the grassy knoll, which was kind of to the right in front of him, because that was maybe the headshot, they think. It actually was filmed by this guy named Abraham Zapruder, the Zapruder film, which you may have heard about, which was discovered afterwards. And anyway, Kennedy was shot and died within an hour. Right afterwards, they brought him to Parkland Hospital where he died. And so what happened was Lyndon B. Johnson, who was his vice president from Texas, was sworn in as the president of the United States, 36th president. And so that event became known as the Kennedy assassination. And of course, that was really the fourth president to be assassinated, as you know. We've already talked about the other ones that, of course, got killed as well. And actually, within like a few hours right after he got killed, they arrested this guy named Lee Harvey Oswald. You see right here, Oswald was a ex-Marine veteran. And there's a story, I don't know if you ever heard about this, but Oswald actually at one point had gone to the Soviet Union and came back. It's kind of a weird story about it. Some people think he may have been some kind of, who knows, could have been some kind of KGB agent. We don't really know for sure if he got crossed. Maybe they switched him to their side or whatever it was. But they claim he basically shot. They think he shot actually, excuse me, right there. They think Lee Harvey Oswald may have shot John F. Kennedy from what is called the Texas Book Depository, which is a building that was kind of nearby. And he was arrested in the Texas Theater. He actually had, supposedly, they think he had killed this other police officer, supposedly before, I think it was after he shot JFK, they think. The weird thing about, he was shot afterwards, if you know about this, it was kind of strange. Like 2 days later, Oswald was actually shot by this guy named Jack Ruby. He was a guy that owned a Dallas nightclub called the Carousel Club. And there's been some speculation about the two knew each other. I think there's been stories where they actually were seen together prior to the assassination. It's possible that Ruby was involved in it. And so he wanted to basically take out Oswald. So Oswald couldn't basically say anything about it. Some people think Oswald may have been a patsy and he wasn't the real shooter. That's a possibility, but there, of course, is a picture of it. It's actually filmed on live TV. It's crazy, but they were walking him out, Lee Harvey Oswald, to go bring him to like another jail that was larger. And Ruby came out, shot him with a pistol. So there's one on the right where he's getting shot right there. So Oswald died right afterwards, and Ruby would later go on to die in prison. So anyway, so it's kind of like all kinds of stuff came out of that. And of course, if you know much about it, it was investigated afterwards by the Warren Commission. Earl Warren, who was on the Supreme Court, of course, was involved in the investigation of the assassination. And of course, they concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone as the main gunman. But a lot of historians think today that he wasn't, that it may have been more than one conspirator involved in it. Because they think there was at least two gunmen, one maybe in the school book depository, and then maybe one by the grassy knoll. Quite believable, you know. So yeah, there's a lot of speculations, you know, about it more than anything. Now, so talk about what happened after that. Now, LBJ, of course, followed as president, and that's not the slide I want. Where are you at, slide? That's right here. Let me go to LBJ and talk a little bit about him first before I get into, I need to talk about the civil rights in a little bit in a second, but LBJ came in afterwards. So he was the one that became president of the United States afterwards, after Kennedy was killed. So like I say, he was the 36th president of the United States. He would be president from 1963 to 1969. And of course, one of the things that LBJ, as they call him, for short, was famous for was advancing a lot of civil rights legislation, which a lot of it was, influenced by the civil rights movement and all of that. And the civil rights movement was something that started, well, it went back to the early 20th century, but they believe it really started after World War II. That's where it happened. I don't know, I went out for again. It does that to me a lot for some weird reason. But yeah, it started after World War II and all that. And they think it was caused by the fact that a lot of African Americans had gone over to fight in Europe. And like in Europe, they didn't have things like here. Like people were more equal and all that. And so you can go pretty much anywhere, any public place, and nothing's like segregated like here in the United States. And of course, when they came back to the United States after the war, they were like, well, we didn't have any rights. And so what are we fighting for? Going over there to fight for the white man and not really have any rights and all that. And so a lot of them kind of started to band together, and that's what really started the whole civil rights movement, more or less. Truman, though, did help start, like I think I mentioned about this before about President Truman. The early part of like the civil rights was kind of started by him, because Truman was the one that I remember I told you that had started to desegregate the military, like Air Force, Army, Navy, and all of that. And so he started to do that. And then under Eisenhower, they started to even do more, desegregation and stuff like that as well. That would follow. Now, there's one thing that's very important about, of course, the civil rights movement, especially starting in the 1950s. There was one court case which was really important. It was considered a landmark case, by the way. That was the case you've probably heard of called Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. And that's the one that really got the ball rolling on desegregation, like in schools and so on. And it was about this woman named Linda Brown who lived in Topeka, Kansas, and she wanted her child to go to like the nearby school. But they wouldn't let her kid go there because she was black. And so she sued them. And so it went all the way to the Supreme Court, as you know. And what happened was the Supreme Court basically overturned it. And when it overturned was really Plessy versus Ferguson, which has been that 1896 case we had talked about before a long time ago, which was that whole separate but equal idea where, everything needs to be, everything can be equal but separate, which led to segregation. And so it proved to be one of the landmark cases that really started the whole civil rights movement going in the 1950s. And so after that, they'll start, trying to desegregate all the schools in the United States. In the North, it was kind of already started, I think, pretty much at that point. But some places out west and in the South, it was still kind of maybe segregated at that point. So over time, what happened from the 50s to the 60s, desegregation began to decline pretty much. But a lot of your southern states, it did not. They pretty much kept things, segregated, like schools and public places, buses and transportation and things like that. Bathrooms, water fountains were still segregated. My dad told me that, that's pretty much the way it was in Mississippi, like in the 40s and 50s and all that. And they'd have signs, that said colored, water fountain and white water fountain, things like that. Now, there were several events that really propelled the whole civil rights movement. There was one event that's kind of famous, although some people may have staged it a little bit, which it was, no big deal. But they had the Rosa Parks incident. You may have heard about this in Montgomery that happened in December of, happened in 1955 is when it happened. Yeah, 1955. And Rosa Parks was an American seamstress who was on a bus in Montgomery. And she was in the colored section, is where she was sitting. But a white man wanted her seat, and she wouldn't get up. And so she was arrested for it. So that sounds ridiculous, but that's what happened. Anyway, it became a big publicity stunt, which it was. It was a publicity thing to kind of, talk about how all the segregation was bad. And so what happened was it sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted from 1955 to 56. And it became very successful. And of course, over time, it led to the end of, segregated buses, city buses, in Montgomery as an example. They do think that the Montgomery bus boycott, by the way, was actually a copy of something that happened in Baton Rouge. I don't know if you know this or not, but you may have heard of the 1953 Baton Rouge bus boycott. It was actually done by this Christian minister named T.J. Jemison. He's from Baton Rouge. He's the one that started it, and they think it was a kind of a copy of it, is what it was. But his was not well known, and this one kind of gave a lot of publicity, in the civil rights movement and all that. And what happened was in the Montgomery bus boycott, if you know about it, Martin Luther King got involved. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Christian minister from Atlanta, Georgia. And so he started, getting involved in the civil rights movement, forming a lot of non-violent type protests in marches and so on. And King eventually became, as you know, the face of civil rights. I've got some pictures here. Of course, there's Rosa Parks right there, passed away in 2005. So that's her right here. That, of course, is, Martin Luther King, who's very, very famous. And a little bit about Martin Luther King. If you know much about King, he was involved in he wanted non-violent methods. I know today they got all this new stuff. They want to do militant stuff and, rioting and all that stuff they're doing now. He was against all that. He preferred to be more like Mahatma Gandhi. And he was heavily influenced by Gandhi. I don't know if you know that or not. He studied a lot about him in India because Gandhi did this kind of same thing in India, which eventually led to Britain leaving India and India becoming a separate state. And so he had nonviolent stuff, civil disobedience, sit-ins, mass marches, freedom rides, and all that stuff you probably heard about in the 1960s. And as he became a spokesman for it, he formed this this conference called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is really important because that's one of the main conferences that really organizations that really is involved in the whole activism of trying to get civil rights going, the movement. And so it became like the main base of the civil rights activism. So they had a bunch of other groups too you may have heard of. They were big, like, of course, NAACP, you may have heard of them, CORE. Also had the SNCC was another one you may have heard of. Those are all different groups that were kind of involved, of course, in the civil rights movement. King and the civil rights movement influenced a lot of new types of civil rights legislation that were created. Like you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What that act did, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was it basically gave you couldn't like in places of like public accommodation or whatever, it couldn't be segregated. So like buses and restaurants and things like that. And so they made that illegal, to do that kind of stuff. Also, here it is right here. So it ended like segregation in public places. It also banned employment discrimination. That was another thing was in it too, on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. That was all part of that. You may have heard of of course, the most famous thing that came out under LBJ, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You could not discriminate, of course, on voters based on race. It made poll taxes illegal. Literary tests were also made illegal as well. Civil Rights Act of 1968 was another one. This act by Congress prohibited discrimination concerning, you couldn't discriminate concerning those that were buying something, like buying a house or renting a house. So you couldn't prohibit people from doing that based on race, color, sex, national origin, or religion. So none of that can be, done, of course. So those are all new things that, of course, he helped influence Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists that were heavily involved. King was famous, if you know about it, for his March on Washington, which happened in August of 1963, which he helped organize. And its purpose was to basically advocate for equal rights, like employment and so on, and civil rights for African Americans. And of course, as you know, Martin Luther King Jr. was the final speaker that was involved in a bunch of speeches that were made at the Lincoln Memorial, where he gave his famous historic "I Have a Dream" speech. And the speech basically outlined the idea where he called for the end of racism, where white and blacks could be equal to each other, and so on. He even said at the same table, and things like that. And so that was an idea that Martin Luther King Jr. had as well. Also, he was involved in you've heard of the Montgomery March. That was big too in 1965, where King was involved in this march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, which was a series of, I think it was like 3 marches, where they highlighted the racial injustice in Alabama, also trying to get people voting rights in Alabama. And a lot of it was seen on television, especially a lot of the mass violence of it. That's very, very famous. Mostly happened around March of 1965. And there was cases where the police actually beat up some of the protesters. There was one case where they were beat up on the famous Edmund Pettus Bridge going into Selma, Alabama. It was called Bloody Sunday. You may have heard about that. And that became very, very famous, of course. So anyway, they think that all this, protesting, basically helped to sway a lot of the civil rights legislation, of course, in the United States. As you know, Martin Luther King, of course, went on to, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. That's something he was very famous for, which he later received after the March on Washington. I think it was in 1964. Sadly, King was assassinated, if you know about this, in Memphis, Tennessee, April 4th, 1968. There's a famous speech where the day before, I don't know if you've ever seen this speech before. I'll kind of share it with you today, but it's almost like he knew he was going to get shot, get killed. He said that he he wouldn't make it, the rest of the time with everybody else for the civil rights. He said that he had reached the mountaintop.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I mean, so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Okay, a little short, of course, speech there, of course, from Martin Luther King. King was assassinated, if you know about this, like I said, on April the 4th, 1968. Of course, the man that shot him was a man named James Earl Ray, who was actually an ex-con. And of course, some people think he might not have been the real killer, but Martin Luther King was staying at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was shot with a high-powered rifle. And of course, if you know about it, it created a lot of mass riots throughout the United States, the killing of Martin Luther King. So 1960s was really a very turbulent period in American history. All these different people, getting assassinated and all that. All right, so let me go ahead and move on. I need to talk about next and get into and talk about more into LBJ. I need to go back, of course, and get into him and talk about him because he's very important, of course, in the 1960s. Some of the things that he does as president. So, Lyndon B. Johnson, I told you, was president from 1963 to 1969. Of course, the 36th president of the United States. Johnson came in and pretty much continued a lot of the same policies that Kennedy was trying to do in his so-called, I think I told you, his New Frontier program. Anyway, you can concentrate a lot on, if you know about it, on the war on poverty. It was this big thing, war on poverty, so-called Great Society, which I'll get to in a little bit. And then, of course, he's the one that did all the landmark civil rights legislation. He pretty much got them passed. I think I don't know if Kennedy could have done it. I think only LBJ could because he had so much power as a U.S. senator. But what happened was Johnson ran for re-election in 1964 against Republican Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who was kind of considered more like a conservative Republican, like one of the first running, if you think about that time. And his vice presidential running mate was Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. So they ran together and all of that. And LBJ, by the way, ran a really good campaign with a lot of different colorful political ads. And he tried to paint Goldwater as this right-wing fringe candidate who had connections with the Ku Klux Klan, which was a possibility. And so Goldwater, they thought Goldwater, if he got nuclear weapons and was president of the United States, he might blow up the world. So if you know about it, one thing that's very, very famous about the 1964 presidential election, they ran campaign ads, which they'd never done before. I don't think they did in 1960, as far as I remember. But in 1964, they ran some of the first political ads ever. And if you know about it, LBJ ran this political ad that was really good. It really worked, which was called Daisy Girl, which I can show you. It's only like a minute long, but I'll show it to you if you want to. I'll show it to you real quick. But it's really, really good ad.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So anyway, yeah, that's a really good one there. Of course, that ad, which is probably one of the first famous ones ever done, if you think about it. All right. So anyway, going back to this election, yeah, because of like ads like that, LBJ just beat Goldwater pretty bad. It was a landslide victory, getting 486 electoral votes, 43 million votes. And then, of course, Goldwater only got 52 electoral votes, or 27 million. So they started calling LBJ after that landslide Lyndon, because of the fact that he had beaten him so good and all that. The only thing that's interesting about that election, you start seeing Goldwater was really considered to be one of the first conservative type politicians that ran for the Republican Party. You'll see this more later. Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, they all start getting kind of more conservative. And one thing that is true about this election, you start to see some changes with the voting. In the South, there's no more solid South anymore, it looks like it after that, because pretty much you start seeing a lot of the Southern votes going to the Republicans. So you got a lot of white Southerners switching from the Democrat to the Republican Party, pretty much. So that all started pretty much with the 1964 election, when that actually would happen. Now, talk about LBJ. LBJ, of course, when he ran for president again, 1964, came up with this so-called Great Society program that he ran on. And it was this idea that was kind of a continuation of JFK stuff, but basically it was a way to alleviate, it was basically done to alleviate poverty in America and help out the elderly and all that. And civil rights reform, of course, was a big thing. Of course, that was all part of the Great Society program. So that was his big thing he was known for. I got a few examples of some things, of course, that he was known for. Medicaid, you probably heard of, was something that he developed as part of the Great Society program. That, of course, was done to help out the poor, to get them, health care Also, they had Medicare, of course, for the elderly is another one that was also pretty big as well. So that's another one that was, you've probably heard of. Head Start program. That was something they developed to help out mostly poor children, preschool type children, was something else that he was known for. Now, I already talked about the civil rights stuff he did. Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968, the Voting Rights Acts of 1965 were also important as well. So he did all those things were examples of things that he did also as well. I don't think you gotta know about all these, but these are all different things you may have heard of that LBJ did. Economic Opportunity Act to help out the more impoverished people get jobs. Job Corps, you might hear of Job Corps. Upward Bound, still around. It's called TRIO or TRIO Bound. Food Stamp Act, Social Security Act, 1964-65. Now, LBJ is the one that started welfare, and all that. And of course, there's a debate about whether the Great Society worked or not, like his programs. They do know that poverty rates among African Americans dropped because of some of the things that LBJ did with this. Like they say, the poverty rate before the Great Society was like 55% for African Americans, and it dropped to 27%. But it's still high today. It's still close to 20%. It might be less than that. It's hard to say what it is today, but they think it's somewhere in that range. Still pretty high. I think the poverty rate of most other Americans, like white or whatever, is maybe half that, more or less. So there's been some critics of the war on poverty. Some people think that it didn't work like it should have. In that, what happened was people got too dependent on it, like from the getting government help and all that. And if you know about the war on poverty, it was all created to get people out of poverty. And the problem is that some people became impoverished. It was supposed to get you out of it, and some people just stayed in it and just don't get out. So it's like a cycle of poverty. But a lot of these programs were, like I said, made to basically get people out of poverty and all that to help you get out, but not to stay in it, and do it forever. All right, now the thing I need to talk about that's very famous, of course, about LBJ, if you know about, is that under Lyndon Johnson, the United States, of course, got involved in the Vietnam War conflict. That was the one thing that really destroyed his whole second part of his term. You know about that as president. And a lot of people saw it as like a failure in the end. So what happened, because you had all these Americans that got killed in the war, and it created a lot of chaos in the country because it created a lot of protests against it, riots and things like that that broke out. And the Vietnam War was something that really wasn't even our problem. It was actually something that the French had started like a long time ago. Like the French back in the 1940s and 50s got involved in the Indochina War over there because the French were trying to expand their empire again after World War II and take over Asia. And so it led to the so-called First Indochina War, which I think started from 1945 and it went up to 1954. And the French ended up fighting what they call the Viet Minh, who were communists. And the Viet Minh were these Vietnamese that wanted to create their own state, like Vietnam, which will be later. And Viet Minh was known as the Vietnamese Nationalist Independence Front. That's what it was called. They called it Viet Minh for short. It was led by this man named Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist, Vietnamese communist. And he was later the president of North Vietnam. He's one of their main leaders that fights against us in, of course, the Vietnam War that we have later. What happened was the French got defeated by the Viet Minh in 1954. You may have heard of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which forced the French to actually withdraw from Indochina. And so what happened was afterwards they divided the Indochina into two states. They had what they call North Vietnam, and they had what they call South Vietnam. Both of these states, by the way, were divided at the 19th parallel. It's kind of like North Vietnam. Remember how North Vietnam was divided at the 38th parallel. And North Vietnam was basically communist. It was backed by, like China and the Soviet Union. And of course, it was led by President Ho Chi Minh. He was the president of it for most of the war until he died, I think, before the war ended, all that. And South Vietnam was more like, it was a Republican state. And I think they call it Republic of Vietnam. And it was led by Ngo Dinh Diem, who was kind of like a right-wing dictator who the U.S. backed. So South Vietnam was capitalist, democracy, democratic republic. And then, of course, the North was, communist. So that's the big differences, between basically, both sides. What happened was later they would get in a war, of course, against the U.S. would eventually fight them later, as you know. And the United States actually had to fight two different enemies in Vietnam. We had to fight, of course, the NVA, which is the North Vietnamese Army. And they also had what they call the NLF, which was the National Liberation Front. And these were actually Vietnamese guerrillas that fought in South Vietnam. They were known affectionately as the Viet Cong, or also called, which means basically Vietnamese communist. And a lot of people call them BC for short, or I think a lot of people call them Charlie, or something like that. They had all kinds of names they called them. And so, yeah, we had to fight both those. And that's part of why the war was very difficult, because you didn't know where the enemy was. It might be somebody that you just went into a village and they might turn around and attack you. So it was kind of an issue that they had. It was a very difficult war. And of course, very difficult because it was like a guerrilla war, and they had to fight a lot like in the jungles of Vietnam. So, how did we get in the war? Well, LBJ, you study about it, got us in the war because of an incident that happened in what is called the Gulf of Tonkin. Gulf of Tonkin, as they usually dub it. There was an incident where apparently some Vietnamese gunboats from North Vietnam may have fired on us. So it's kind of debated if it really happened or not. I think some people think it didn't happen. There's been one speculation about it. I think it was actually just one destroyer, but I think it was another that may have been shot at too as well. But there was one called the USS Maddox, which was a destroyer on the Gulf of Tonkin. And I think it may have been fired at, I don't think torpedoes, but at least machine guns. I know that. Maybe it could have been torpedoes, but it happened at night. And so they saw it on radar. And they thought maybe somebody's shooting at them. And so they fired back at them. And so basically that became the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident or Maddox incident. And so the U.S. used that as a pretext to go into Vietnam, to basically fight North Vietnam. And so Congress eventually issued the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically gave the U.S. a right to go in there, fight kind of like a police action, but not actually officially declare war against them. And at first, we just bombed them, I think, from 64 to 65. Then in 1965, we started sending actual real troops into Vietnam. And what happened was by 1968, we had pretty much gotten about 500,000 troops into Vietnam to actually fight them. And over time, what happened was almost 60,000 American soldiers died fighting in the conflict alone. I think 68, we had about, I forget how many died in that year, but I think in 68 was the worst year. We had something like 15, 20,000 soldiers die in 1968. And if you study about the Vietnam War, the peak event of it was the Tet Offensive, which you may have heard about, which happened at the beginning of 1968, about January, February of 1968. And what happened was the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong decided to coordinate attacks all over South Vietnam, which were kind of like sneak attacks. They were surprise attacks. Nobody knew they were going to happen. It all happened during the Vietnamese New Year, which is called Tet. And so it really shocked everybody. We actually won. it was like a tactical victory where we wiped out most of the Viet Cong. But it shocked the United States. It shocked the public. And people started to think at that point that there's no light at the end of the tunnel, that we're not going to be able to get out of this war and all that. And so a lot of people basically turned against basically the war in LBJ. People started turning against it and all of that. Some pictures, of course, of the Vietnam War, by the way, is called sometimes a helicopter war because they use so many helicopters, if you know about the war, which is very famous about it. And so what happens, basically, you get all these massive anti-war protests that follow against, Johnson, and of course, later Richard Nixon has the same problem in the early 70s overall. And as the casualties began to mount in the war, protests became worse. College students, got involved in it. People burned their draft cards and all of that. I think the women burned their bras, about that as well in the 1960s. And people even began doing like chants, like anti-war chants, which you may have heard of, which the most famous was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And a lot of these mass protests became so bad that if you know about the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, it got violent at that actual convention, where a lot of people converged on there for different reasons, but a lot of it was people protesting because of the war. Oh, other quotes that were famous were, "Hell no, we won't go. Make love, not war." This one you may have heard of. 18 today, dead tomorrow. There's another quote. That's probably not as big. But the "make love, not war," of course, was a big thing, of course, in the 60s. So, yeah, the convention, the convention was held, like I said, during a period of violence. They had basically just had the whole Martin Luther King Jr. assassination that occurred. And of course, riots in all kinds of cities, across the United States, and you have all this violence, civil unrest. It was just really a mess, if you know about it, in the 1960s and all of that. So that's what leads into, the 1968 election. That's very famous. And of course, one of the things that really shocked a lot of people in 1968 was that Lyndon B. Johnson on TV announced that he was not running for re-election. It shocked a lot of people because people thought he could probably still run because he didn't really serve much in the first one after Kennedy got killed. And so he could have served another term. And so it shocked a lot of people. And so it led basically the whole Democratic field open. So a lot of different people, basically ran for re-election. And there are different people that ran. Of course, the most famous on the Republican side was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, of course, ran as a Republican. He would be their nominee. I think Spiro Agnew was his vice president that was under him. Now, the Democrats had three people running. They had, of course, Robert F. Kennedy, of course, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was like the main anti-war candidate who ran really in the whole race. Hubert Humphrey, of course, had been LBJ's vice president from Minnesota. He ran too, also as well. You may have heard of the firebrand, of course, segregationist George Wallace. That's one that's tried to stop people from going to school at University of Alabama when he stood in this doorway. You know about that. The governor of Alabama. So he ran too as well. So you had these three people running for president. And what happened was, which is very famous, if you know about this, was that Robert F. Kennedy was doing pretty good in the primaries, just won in California. This happened in June of 1968. And they were celebrating his victory in the Ambassador Hotel. And as he walked out through somewhere through the kitchen or something like that in the hotel, he was shot on June 5th, 1968. And so Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated too. It's crazy what happened with that as well. So he was shot dead. And the guy that shot him was this man named Sirhan Sirhan, who was a Palestinian Christian. he was mad supposedly over the fact that Kennedy supported the idea of giving military aid to Israel. It was angering him a lot. And so he was actually arrested. He's still actually alive. It's kind of crazy about this, but the guy's been in prison forever, Sirhan. And of course, there's been a lot of conspiracy theories about Sirhan, but they think pretty much that he likely did it, as far as they know. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories, but now and maybe not so much compared to some other ones. So anyway, talking about the election and all that, go back to that in a second. Lost it for some reason. But talking about the 1968 election of what happened. Yeah, like I said, there was all these riots and violence, of course, that happened in Chicago. Of course, it was well known at the 1968 DNC. And, of course, Vietnam veterans were there, protests at hippies, the Black Panthers, all these kind of groups kind of converged. So it was like mass violence. And finally, they figured out who the Democratic nominee was. That would be Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. They picked him with Edmund Muskie as his VP nominee. But George Wallace was angry about that. He wanted it. He broke away. He formed his own party, political party, basically, to run independently. And he was part of that so-called American Independent Party. So you basically had three people running, 1968, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace in the election. And Nixon ended up doing pretty good because Nixon concentrated on really two things that helped him get elected. One was he promised that he would restore law and order, kind of like what I think Trump kind of did this in 2016, which kind of helped him get elected, all that. So he promised to restore law and order in America. And then also he wanted to try to end the Vietnam War. And he came up with this idea called Vietnamization. Vietnamization was this idea where what they would do, the United States, is they would turn the war over, the Vietnam War, over to the South Vietnamese and let them fight the war against North Vietnam. And they would just supply them and train them, stuff like that. And then we would just withdraw our troops, which is what he does eventually between 1969 to 73. But it later failed. If you know about that, the South Vietnamese just weren't as good as the North Vietnamese, and they later lost. If you know about that. They think due to the mass violence of 1968, and of course the Democratic Party being split between Humphrey and Wallace, Nixon eventually won in a landslide, 301 electoral votes. Humphrey 191 to 46 which really wasn't close at all. Here's a map showing you, of course, the election of 1968 and all that. So you can see here, a lot of the solid South starting to go. You can start seeing it because, Nixon gets Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri. So all these are here. Of course, Humphrey got Texas, probably because of LBJ, all that. And then Wallace was able to get Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. So it's interesting how that's going with that. And what's interesting about this election, which you'll see later, by 1972, one thing that happens, Nixon had this thing called the Southern Strategy, where he was trying to get Southerners to vote Republican, to convert over from Democrat to Republican. And that's one thing that he does do, which is very famous. Nixon and Reagan really helped to do that, to convert a lot of white Southerners to the Republican Party. And that's why a lot of the South, a lot of times votes Republican because of Nixon. So anyway, later I'm going to, probably not today, I'm going to kind of continue later talking about the Vietnam War. I'll kind of go into what happens with the Vietnam War under, Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon's going to change the war, but they find out a lot of things that are kind of controversial about the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre. They bombed Vietnam, they bombed Cambodia, and they go into Cambodia. These are things that kind of are a big problem in the late 60s. And then, of course, the big thing they find out later, if you know about it, which is really getting in the 70s, I guess, early 70s, I'll get to later. And that, of course, is the Watergate scandal, which hits, of course, Nixon, which forced him to resign. So pretty much I'm going to stop here because next week, I guess starting on Tuesday, I'll get into the 1970s. Talk about Nixon after that and whatever else that comes next, pretty much. So that's pretty much it for today. Before we go, don't forget, I don't need that slide, but don't forget about various assignments due this week that y'all need to do, which, of course, the main one, of course, is that World War II and New Deal Canvas quiz. I have pushed it back a couple days, so you do have till Saturday to wrap that up. And then don't forget to send me, of course, your research paper that you have. Hope you're working on that. You need to get that done because that's a lot of points. But try to get that to me as soon as you can. You can upload that to the speed grader and all that. And I will be posting this lecture to my YouTube channel later. So if you have any comments, questions, let me know about this lecture. And that's pretty much it for today. So I'll see you later. I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. And that's it for this lecture overall. So take care.